All
Says
right.
you are live.
Can everyone hear us? I assume that we're good to go. Ooh, I'm glad that people have already started getting the book in. Well, we can just go ahead and jump on into it then. Thank you, everyone who is joining us tonight. Good evening. And obviously, we're here to celebrate the launch of Erin's book, Mechanize My Hands to War. I have my copy right here. And of course, we're here to celebrate Erin herself. My name is Jared Johnson. I am Erin's agent, and we both hope that you enjoy a little bit of this sort of behind the scenes look at this incredible story. This book has been years in the making, and as Erin's agent, I'm thrilled that it's finally made its way into readers' hands. Mechanize My Hands to War is a stark exploration of the use of AI, its impacts on our lives of, as everyday people, and the ripples that such technology can have on all aspects of our society. And for obvious reasons that we don't have to talk about here, because we all know, this is a very sort of prescient book for where we are right now as a society. I did just want to, bring a little bit of praise to this book because not everyone understands kind of what goes into getting a book published. So I did just, want to point out that, as of this book launch, Publishers Weekly has given the book a starred review. For those of you who are not in the publishing industry, this is a pretty big deal. It's not easy to achieve. And so I think that this is a great marker that's definitely worth celebrating and calling out. It's also currently on the TBR list, the to be read list for more than 4,800 people on Goodreads. And as of today, we've also received a few new blurbs. And so in celebration of the book, I am going to read a couple of those blurbs for you, and then go over a little bit of prolegomena, and then we'll just jump right into it. So the first blurb that came in today is from Linda Kodega, the author of Moth Eater, which I think is actually forthcoming, comes out in February from Erewhon Press. But Linda said, centered on the inflection points of conscience, Mechanize My Hands to War is a captivating novel uniquely crafted to throw off a reader's expectations by presenting a dozen reflections of an imminent future where the assumption of humanity is not guaranteed. And then the second one, this is from Allison Stein, the author of Trashlands, and a few other books as well. Allison says, this expansive, gripping read is reminiscent of Philip K. Dick, yet envisions a speculative and searing world all its own. A troubling glimpse into our possible future, Mechanize My Hands to War reinvents the android story within the rich setting of an Appalachia as familiar as it is far away, and with characters who drill deep into your heart, even or especially those who aren't alive. A rust-filled rural pastoral, it is at its core a parable of trust, of community, and of the ways, shapes, and future of caring for each other and of going on, which I think is a great way to describe this book, having read it a few times. And I think that a lot of you will agree with me as well. So, like I said, just as a little bit of prolegomena, and to give you a sort of order of operations for this evening's events, Erin is going to begin with a reading of the book. After that, Erin and I are going to have a brief conversation, sort of like a live Q&A for you all about the book, what went into its creation, and a bit of how it's kind of come to be on shelves and in many of your hands now. That being said, during the Q&A portion, if any of you have your own questions that you want to ask that you would like, Erin and I to discuss, or any questions you want Erin to answer, please put them into the chat. We're going to be watching it. We'll be responding to you. And, we have sort of a formal operation, but really this is an intimate gathering. This is a chance for us to celebrate. And so any questions that you want to ask, we'll be more than happy to talk about. So without further ado, Erin, take it away.
Okay. Just want to thank everybody for showing up. I'm seeing a lot of names of people I care about a lot in the comments. So thank you all for coming and joining. I know that even an hour sometimes during this time of year can be a lot to ask, so I appreciate it. And many thanks to Jared and all the people at DAW who have had to read this numerous times in different capacities to make it what it is right now. As I was going through and trying to figure out what piece to read, what I will say is this is coming out December 17th, but is not, shall we say, necessarily a cheerful holiday romp. So I think there's maybe snow in one chapter. So If you need to wait until the new year, that's fine. But I was trying to pick a chapter that focuses in on one of the children who eventually gets sucked into a child militia, essentially. So this chapter is looking at her experience with her father. And I'm going to give you a couple of excerpts. So she has sort of an experience with her father. You'll see the very beginning of that. The parts you won't hear is her father kind of leaves suddenly. She finds out that he left to join this militia called the Civil Union and that he has died. And she's grappling and arguing with her mother about what this means and decides herself that she needs to figure out where her dad went and why he went. So you'll see just a little bit of her trying to ask some of his companions also at a local bar about where to go and how she gets kind of sucked into that. So I will start with that and then hopefully we can have a chat. So this is chapter 4, our character's perspectives, Leah, and we start in October 2057. Her 8th birthday coincided with the start of hunting season, so Leah's dad woke her up at 4 a.m. He asked her what candy bars she wanted to bring, and he showed her where he was packing the rifles in the boxes of shells. "Don't touch that without my say-so," he said, his voice dropping into stern warning. She nodded and sat on the couch and watched him prep the rest of the gear. She picked at the fraying threads on the corner of the cushion. The dog whined around her feet. He wanted fed. "Dad, Shadow's hungry." "Your mom will take care of it." He was distracted, staring into the fridge. She hoped he wouldn't take the beer. "Are we going to say goodbye to Mom?" She looked at the long bag by the door and the collapsible stools leaned against the frame. The cooler was open near it, waiting for the rest of the food. The chocolate was already tucked safely in the bottom. "Do you have your boots on?" he asked, ignoring her question. She stared at her double-layered socks. "No." "Well, go put them on then. We're wasting daylight here." "It's not light yet." "Will be soon. Go find them now." She obeyed, rolling off the couch. The dog nipped at her cheek and she giggled, pushing him away. "Leah?" Dad's voice was in that dangerous in-between place, not quite angry, but close. She pushed herself up and scurried down the hall of the double-wide. Baby was still asleep, not screaming yet. She could see through the crack of the doorway, Mom slumped in the rocking chair by the crib, a spit cloth draped over one shoulder, her robe half open. She was snoring, head flung back on the pillow. Leah almost wanted to wake her to make sure she'd gotten the instructions for the cake right. Last year, there had been chocolate with vanilla icing, and it was important that both cake and icing be chocolate this time. Dad coughed in the kitchen, and Leah ran into her bedroom. She rummaged under her bed, pulling out her backpack and a balled-up sweater, a naked doll, and then the doll's dress and shoes. "Where are your boots?" Dad loud whispered from the door. "I'm looking. Seems like you found everything but your boots." He got down on his knees beside her. The paper crackled in the backpack, crunched under one of his legs. "You're going to mess up my homework," she complained. He snorted. "Ain't any 8-year-old have homework worth worrying about." She frowned. "It's math." Dad looked at her, his mouth set in the way she hated. "Leah, look at me." She was looking at him. "I need you to focus here. Get your boots. We're leaving. Damn if I'll let Jason get an 8-point before me." "I'm trying." He sighed somewhere in the back of his throat. "Get out of the way. Get on the bed." She clambered up and pulled her legs under her while Dad stretched himself at full length, half of his body under the bed. Mom came in while he was like that. "What are you doing?" Dad tried to scramble back out so quickly that he hit his head on the bed. "Hunting," Leah said. "And Mom, what kind of cake are you making for me? I want to talk about the cake." "Leah, I'm not talking about the cake right now." She pulled her robe close and fiddled with the tie around her waist. "What are you doing, Sam?" Leah crossed her arms and fell back on her pillow. "Look, Val, I know you're not a big fan of Leah going out, but hey, you gonna have her left out of this? All the other guys are taking their kids out. It's a school day. You don't know how much longer they'll let us hunt these woods. Pretty soon town's gonna declare it protected land. Government says hands off, fixing to discontinue licenses. We don't take her out now, it's gonna get a lot harder. Sam, she has school. And school will be there tomorrow. It is 4 a.m. and she is 8 years old. What are you thinking? Leah, get back in your PJs. You're going back to bed." "No, she's not." "Sam." He stood up, and he didn't do anything or say anything else, but Mom took a step back anyway. Leah saw her boots in the corner of the room near her books and animals. Sam, Mom cleared her throat. She needs sleep. She needs to go to school. Valerie, this is what I have. This is all I got. I'm going to let her see how it's done. And maybe they'll stop giving out licenses next year or the year after, but this is the year we can go. You aren't Robin Hood. And Leah remembered that for a lot of years because she knew the cartoon, old as it was. This isn't something you need to make one of your fights. I don't make the fights. They come for you or they don't. Mom shook her head and she was close to crying. Leah could tell because there's a redness she got around the eyes, far more than she actually sat down and bawled. I don't know why you're doing this. What kind of bullshit is that? This is all I've got. She waved wildly toward the door and the hallway and where the baby was sleeping. When you've got your son, 2 months old, and your daughter, you have a family and a job and a place to sleep, food to eat. I can't even listen to this crap. There's no job. Leah almost missed the words, and the silence after swallowed them up. Mom's face had gone still, and she was trying hard not to show what she was feeling. That refusal to show, that was when Leah knew she was really upset. What was that? She asked. Lips thin, eyes thin. They finished it at work, the new system, a whole crew of robots in there. They laid off me and a bunch of the other guys. This was yesterday? When were you going to tell me? Like she was choking on the words, thick and rough in her throat. I was going to tell you. And Leah wondered if he was scared himself now. There was something flighty in his eyes, like he might do anything or say anything, and they wouldn't be prepared for it. Skittish, Dad called the deer when they look like that. She learned this over the next months as she went hunting with him. The licenses weren't revoked. They weren't necessarily handed out. But no one cared anymore after a while. There were larger things and barren fields and empty stomachs to worry about. Sometimes, before the game got thinned out, the deer helped feed those empty stomachs. Mom turned and left the room, her robe flapping out behind her, but quiet other than that. She went into the baby's room and closed the door, just a click as it closed. Dad, Leah whispered to his back, I found my boots. Not that she really cared about that anymore, but she was scared. She felt cold inside. He didn't answer for a minute, but then he shook his shoulders as if waking himself up out of a doze. That's good, honey, good. Why don't you put them on and we'll head out? We don't want to lose any more daylight than we already have. And just like that, like nothing had happened and Mom hadn't disappeared, he packed them up to go hunting. The truck was almost empty, so they stopped by a station on the way out. The sun was creeping up over the trees, and it was gray and quiet. Dad kept a close eye on the numbers ticking up at the pump. He didn't fill the tank, just enough to jumpstart the electric converter. Want a candy bar, he said when he climbed back in. She nodded, still a little afraid to talk. She wasn't usually allowed to have candy before noon, so the opportunity was too good to pass up. 8, that's crazy. You're 8 years old? He looked both ways, though the road was empty as far as she could see, back toward home and the other way, out of town and toward the woods. You know how old I am, she said, hesitant or resistant to go along with his joking tone. Yeah, I know. He smiled at her then, big and broad, the way that she loved, or knew she loved later, the way that made her feel like nothing was wrong after all. I was there, right outside the room. I heard you wailing the moment you came out. Did I really? Did I really cry that much? What? Yeah, sure you did. And suddenly he seemed on edge, again, as if her question, innocent and curious, had been meant to throw him off. They rode the rest of the way in silence. He pulled off in a field. The tires bent the long grasses down in front of them and left a trail behind. It was impossible to ignore they'd been here. She couldn't tell if there were deer or squirrel here. She didn't know the signs well enough, but their tracks stood out like a sore thumb. It'll be a walk, he said, over that hill. He opened the bed of the truck, slung the gun case and the stools over his shoulder. Here, you grab the cooler. She took it from him, strapped it over her chest. She zipped her hoodie closer as a wind ruffled their hair. The neon orange vest bunched up under her arms. This is perfect temperature. He smiled again, or tried to, and jutted his chin toward the hill. Come on, we'll set up just a little ways into the woods. A lot of deer come that way, heading into the field to look for food. It seems mean, she said, following him, the soft shell of the cooler hitting against her leg. He seemed only half there with her now. He was scanning the grasses and brush around them, constant tiny movements of his head. She stared up at his back, broad and plaid. The camo duffel bag with the shells rattled in time with his pace. They're just trying to find food. He laughed, but there's a rough edge to it, warning her she could cut herself. Girl, ain't we all? He cautioned her, when they reached the right spot, to set her stuff down quietly. Make no more noise in the wind, he whispered. Try to be as much a part of it all as you can, still as a tree. He had them set up behind a bunch of low trees and scrub. Natural blind, he mouthed. Dad prided himself on using very little gear outside the guns themselves. She'd heard him mock the visitors in their cabin rentals by the lake. Though the people staying there the last few months weren't hunters. They were men and women from some big city sent to oversee the updating of the factory where Dad worked. He took his time, pulling the rifles free from the bag and in complete silence. Reminded her how to load one with slow, exaggerated movements. It was like watching a woman present prizes on a TV game show. The shell slid into the chamber with hardly a sound. He set the loaded gun aside and pulled out a smaller rifle. Before he loaded it, he gestured for her to tuck it into her shoulder and feel the weight of it there. He mimed the kickback, and she tried to hold in a giggle. Then he took it from her and taught her again, by example, how to look down the barrel and aim through the sight. He used his finger to trace his line of sight. After she had tried this herself, he tapped on the safety, tapped it more than once to emphasize its importance. Never point this at someone, he said, breaking his code of silence. Not even if you think the safety's on. She nodded, all thought of laughter gone. Her fingers felt cold as she took the rifle back. She was reminded by his warning what they were here to do, and she faced what she hadn't fully thought on before leaving, not with the argument between him and Mom, not with the excitement of her birthday. She didn't know if she wanted to shoot a deer. They were the good guys in all the books and movies. Watch me for a while, he whispered, hardly loud enough to hear. You'll get your turn in a bit. He didn't load her gun yet. Instead, he lay down on his stomach, elbows buried deep into the mud and loam. He found an opening in the brambles to sight through, and he waited, his breathing so regular and steady and so soft that she could almost imagine he was a machine, a small bellows pumping and pumping. She slid down as soundlessly as she could, her boots shoving aside leaves and mushrooms, and leaned back against the tree behind them. Sunlight, bright and almost white in its early morning brilliance, shot down through the leaves above, and the air and the trees and the whole wood seemed like it was waiting, quiet and still, like it had absorbed her into some larger ecosystem, and she was small and easily overlooked, and safe here, up against the tree. She closed her eyes and tried to pretend that she was alone. And I'm just going to jump ahead, and this is a smaller portion here where Leah runs away after she, like I said, has learned about her dad's death in the civil union, has argued with her mom because her mom's angry with her husband. And she's determined to go and find out where he's gone. So she's prepared to sneak out, and she has her pack, and she's heading out to try and find out more. It was cold outside when there was no sun to counter the chill air. She could see the streetlights on the main road just past the entrance to the trailer park, but it was dark here in the strip of grass outside the double wide. He was a coward. Mom's words echoed faintly as she stared off toward the lights. Something rustled in the neighbor's yard. Leah froze as still as she could and glanced in that direction. A deer lifted its head over the wire fence, returning her gaze. They both stood quiet for a minute or two. Leah counted the seconds in her head. When she didn't move, its jaw worked slowly as if it were coming back to life. She lifted her hand and adjusted the backpack. The deer's ears perked up, and then it sprang over the fence and ran away into the maze of trailers. Leah shivered and zipped up her coat. Her boots, when she finally began walking, were quiet on the gravel road, barely crunching the fine rock. There was a haze, a night fog that softened the lights ahead and made them waver a bit. She crossed her arms and hugged herself, and when she reached the juncture of main road and gravel road, she stopped again. She looked both ways down the main road. She knew if she went right, she would arrive at the factory, tall and dark and empty in the night air, with little ghost lights in the windows and an occasional shadow where an automaton moved back and forth behind the glass. It was surrounded by vast parking lots littered with potholes, only half filled anymore, even during the day. To the left was town, what was left of it, after years of decay and business closures. The bar with the graffiti emblazoned on its side and a neon light buzzing over the door was the first thing she would come by. She knew that Dad's friends still hung out there. She hoped they might have answers for her or an address. So she turned left, even though there was something tugging at her belly, asking her to turn back, to go into her mom's bedroom and say she was sorry, to ask her advice. What do I do with myself, Mom? What do I do now? But maybe that was her mom's voice even now. Maybe that wasn't really Leah. Mom, who was always asking that question in little ways. What are we supposed to do now? Over bills in thin envelopes with cellophane windows. Over dinner burnt in the oven. Over the grown too tall lawn. She never seemed to find an answer. It was late, and there were no cars on the road. The way to town dipped in and out of shadow at first. The streetlights gradually grew closer together, and Leah could tell she had not far left to go when she crossed the train tracks and the lights bled into each other, one after another down the main drag. She could hear the bass beat from the bar, even a block away. When she came in sight of it, she clutched the straps of her backpack and swallowed down puke. The graffiti, the flag torn in two, the fists, was half in darkness, but the door was bright, framed in light from inside and from the neon sign above. The sign advertised a brand of beer. There were two men and a woman grouped by the door, shoulders hunched up against the cold, smoking. She didn't say anything at first when she walked up to them, but she couldn't bring herself to pass them. "Where's your parents, kid?" The man who spoke was wearing a plaid shirt layered over a Henley with ragged cuffs. He flicked a cigarette between two fingers. She didn't recognize him by sight, but there was something to the sound of his voice that seemed familiar. "Honey, what are you doing out so late?" the woman chimed in, trying to pitch her voice as comforting. Her hair was pulled back tight from her face, so she looked gaunt in the neon light. "Sam was my dad," she said quietly. "Sam who?" the second man asked. His voice was too loud, like he'd been drinking for a long time. "Shut up, Dave." The woman shoved him in the shoulder. "It's Sam Sadowski's kid. You can tell just by that hair." Leah self-consciously raised a hand to her ponytail. "What are you doing here? It's past midnight." Dave didn't sound any more welcoming. Leah swallowed. "I want to know where my dad went." The woman raised a hand to her mouth, and Leah saw the sympathy welling up in her eyes. Her face was flushed. She had been drinking, too. "No," Leah interrupted. "What I mean is where he went before. I want to know where to find the civil union." The first man laughed, his voice husky from smoking. "The civil union's everywhere, ain't it? That's what they say." He pumped his fist in the air and howled, throwing his head back. "Civil union's here, kid." The woman slapped his arm. "Really, Karen? How many drinks is that for you?" She turned her attention back to Leah. "What's your name, honey?" "Leah." "Okay, Leah, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go back home, walk back where you came from. There's nothing good where you're looking." "He left for a reason." Leah hitched the backpack further up her shoulders. "He was a coward. What adult would send her back home by herself through the dark?" She scanned the faces of the smokers again. They were grim and sharp-lined. "I know he came here a lot, and I know that sign." She pointed to the graffiti. "I did that," Kieran grinned, thumping his narrow chest. "Just another bad decision," the woman growled under her breath. "No one here really believes in anything, honey. We just get drunk and we do stupid things. That's all there's left to do." "Why don't you let the kid in, Mary?" The voice was new, from the doorway. Leah didn't know how long it had been open. The man wore an old military jacket with the insignias torn off. The woman almost jumped in surprise when he spoke. "How long have you been standing there?" She took a long drag from her cigarette, then dropped it, stamping out the spark from the concrete. She coughed. "The girl was just going home." "Girl? Leah, was it? Says she wants to know about the civil union. Let her in here." Mary stepped aside, and Leah moved forward, almost without thinking about it. She had the creepiest sense of déjà vu as she stepped into the bar, as if she, or someone else, had done this many, many times before, as if a man like this had lingered in many bars in many small towns with many half-empty factories a mile down the road. "Eli would like you," the man said, sliding into a booth. She stood by the table. The bar smelled like smoke and old sour beer. "He likes kids with go-get-'em attitudes." "I just want to know where my dad went," she said, but her voice sounded small, even to her own ears, weak and ineffective. "I'll tell you that," he said. "Hell, I'll drive you there myself if you want." Leah felt a little dizzy. In the back of her mind, she blamed Mary for not keeping her from coming in here. "How far away is it?" The words came out, and she couldn't take them back. She told herself she didn't want to. She shoved down the sickness in her stomach. She shoved down that tugging. "Far away from here, but not that far." She knew the answer didn't make any sense, but it was an answer. She gripped the straps of her backpack tighter. Okay, she said. So that's the reading. That's the reading part.
I have a couple of thoughts about it. My first, now, we can share with everyone here. You and I historically have had a debate about this particular chapter, because when you submitted this to me and I wanted to represent it, it was a debate that we had about whether or not this chapter should actually stay. And I thought it should be cut because it doesn't exactly tie in as heavily to the overarching narrative as some of the other chapters do. Hearing you read it, I'm just going to say I think you converted me. I mean, obviously it stayed whenever we went on submission with it. But I think it does a couple of things incredibly well. One, we are both, children of Appalachia. We were born and raised Appalachia. And I think that is always very much a sort of part of our identity. And I think that you've captured sort of the feeling of what Appalachian life is like for so many people, with Leah's story, and especially like her father and the relationship that they have. There's that sort of tension that reminds me in many ways of my own relationship with my father. I think it also really gets at what the core of this book is actually offering to readers, and that is, the book is a collection of vignettes, but they're vignettes of lives that feel very real. This is a very real story. I mean, it's a fictitious character, but it feels incredibly real whenever you read it or hear it read. And so I think it's good that it stayed. We'll start getting into the sort of Q&A portion. Like I said, before Erin began reading, if you have any questions yourself, please ask them. We're keeping an eye on chat here. And so we'll be happy to bring them in at any point. But I am just going to jump into it. Prior to this, so Mechanize is your debut novel, but it's not the first thing that you've published. You've published several short stories, novella about androids and AI for almost a decade at this point. What first inspired you to begin thinking about androids and AI, and what draws you to the psyche of a non-human mind?
Well, I think I'm going to do this weird debate move where I'm like, I also want to address the comment that you made just before. And
Sure,
then I
absolutely.
Yeah, I kind of forgot that we'd had that back and forth about this part of the chapter. So I swear I wasn't like, I'm going to stick it to Jared and do this as the reading. And
no, we talked for a while about like what chapter you should read from for this. And I think that this was the right choice.
And since it is a little bit more standalone, like you'll find how it's linked in as you read, but it's a little easier to like lift it out. And I also want to say, I did go hunting with my dad, and it was not nearly this tension-filled. So I just want to put that out there. You may or may not be watching right now. But mostly that was just a ridiculous situation because it was me being like, I see the squirrel. I see it. I see it. And my dad was like, the squirrel left like 20 minutes ago, Erin. Like, there's no squirrel there anymore. But to the AI question, to a certain extent, I think it would be fake of me to say like I had a really explicit reason when I started, because I think I was just like, these are cool. Robots are cool. Androids are cool. I like that stuff in literature. The more I think about it and the more I find myself writing about it, I realize at least what I've come to think is important about it is that ultimately as humans, I think we're always looking to define who we are by looking for something we decide is not human. So we're like, okay, if I'm not an animal in terms of kind of social structure, then what does that mean? If I'm, not an alien, what does that mean? Of course, we can talk about how that rhetoric gets used in lots of upsetting ways as well. But I think what is interesting then about looking at AI and androids, robots, whatever iteration of that, is ultimately about who we are. Because of course there's the ultimate struggle where you're like, oh, I wanted to portray something that's not human. I am human. How the heck can I possibly get inside that perspective? So I don't know that there's any way for us ever to get past that or outside of that. But that's why I think it's ultimately a way of thinking about who are we as humans? How distinct are we from other parts of the world? And how do we act or behave to others that we perceive to be not us, which has been obviously not a unique thing in my work. It's been a kind of a staple of science fiction, especially android and robot literature, but it's one that I still feel like is important. It's kind of an eternal question, I think, of how do we treat things that we don't perceive to be us?
Yeah, and it is really interesting to kind of think about sort of creating our own perceptions of our identities through a negative lens, recognizing it as not as what we are positively. I don't mean positive in a sort of moralistic sense, but positive in an expression of putting value onto something rather than kind of extracting what we aren't and therefore building our identity from that. That is going to build into my next question here. Then it's interesting that you kind of set it up like this for me. I didn't, say this in your introduction. You, when you are not, writing books. Yes, thank you, Shelley. That's exactly where I was going. You, you are also a professor and a medievalist. This is one of those interesting ways that lives tend to overlap because, as you know, I am also a former medievalist and was a professor once upon a time. At first glance, it can really seem like science fiction and medieval studies are about as far apart as two subjects can get, at least technologically speaking. But what influence has your academic work had on your fictional writing?
Well, first of all, I do think something that medieval writers are kind of good at is embracing the weird and not caring. Unabashedly just being like, here's a really weird thing where I am going to say I'm married to Christ, or I am, um, imagining a world of fools on a ship, or like whatever aspect it is.
The devil
So,
appeared to me, so I threw myself into a bush. Yeah,
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 all
like
of
stuff
that
like that.
stuff,
Yes.
right? And they weren't afraid to be like, I'm just gonna think about this and think on it. So there's something about reading and working with medieval lit that's sometimes refreshing in that way because they're kind of like, I'm just going to write what I'm going to write. That said, of course, what I then study is people being like, you can't write what you're going to write. Why are you writing that? So that continual tension. Um, so specifically heretics, which Shelley threw out in the chat. Uh, heretics, when I study them, no matter what the belief is they have that is contrary to mainstream orthodoxy at the moment, and sometimes which becomes the new mainstream orthodoxy, depending on how cycles go, is all about we perceive you to be not like us, the mainstream orthodoxy, and therefore you are a threat. And therefore we need to decide. There's often a little period where we're like, maybe we can all coexist. And then people are like, nope, actually we can't. We've decided we can't. Here's a law. Here's something else. And so to me, it seems like a lot of the same question of we're going to define ourselves by defining ourselves against something else.
Yeah. And it is really interesting thinking about, and I'm going to avoid getting into any of the specifics of the book itself, but one thing I think readers will recognize is that oftentimes the finger pointing that happens isn't at whatever institutions are actually creating the androids, the AI. It's at the AI themselves, and it's interesting from that lens, looking at the criticism lodged by humans in the book is against the non-human. Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting thinking about it in that regard. A little bit of sort of behind the scenes look for everybody. When this novel first came across my inbox, it had a different name. So, sort of a peek behind the curtain for everyone who is not in publishing. My hair cannot stay in place today. For everyone not in
That's
publishing.
the sneak peek is about hair and how difficult hair
Yes,
is.
that is the sneak peek. But oftentimes when a project goes to an editor's desk, it has a different title. Sometimes it can have no title. So whatever project name you start out with, it's not always going to be what you end up with, and that was the case for us as well. So the title did change, and it was a point of conversation between you, your editor, head of marketing for several weeks, just going back and forth. So, the initial title, can you sort of speak to the significance of that? Talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think I might just pull in Jamie's question as well.
Absolutely.
And kind of make it a twofer. So the initial title was Year of the Children of Prophets, which was also the title of the short story that this actually started with. So it started as a short story, not as a novel. And it was a short story that was only from the human perspective of someone going out and asking questions about whether they could place a child. So one concept within the novel is the active operations foster corps, where they're trying to rehome children that have been through this really horrendous experience in the child militia. And he's interviewing a specific set of parents that you'll learn about more in the book. And so I wasn't getting a lot of traction with the short story, but I really loved it. And some of the feedback was like, maybe this is part of a bigger world, a bigger story. And so I wrote it out as a novel. The more I've been writing short stories, the more I have liked to chunk things up. It's just easier to keep my own attention while writing. So I tend to write in kind of this mosaic fashion almost. So I did have an idea of the plot, and then I went back and did it from different perspectives. And then I think changed it up a little bit again and went back and changed the chronology. So it was kind of an iterative process. Gosh, you're talking with an academic. They're like, it was an iterative process. And Year of the Children of Prophets was inspired by a Bible verse that's kind of thinking about people inheriting the kind of spiritual gifts that their ancestors have worked for. It was kind of a moment where the New Testament heralds back to and draws from or alludes from the Hebrew Bible. And so I had that verse in there, and I really liked it because I was thinking about sort of creating children and not creating children, a common theme also of android and robot literature. And I've come to reconcile myself a lot with what Daw did, because they were actually pretty smart and knew what they were doing. But I have to say, it can be hard when you're an author at first, letting go of the things that you're like, I have been referring to this book for 3 or 4 years as this title. And especially if you get really attached to consistency in the way things are, it can be hard to give that up. But they were like, we don't know that this is going to tell people enough that this is like a sci-fi book, that this is like something. So the book cover became a little bit more spot on that theme as well, which now, again, I appreciate, even if at first, thank you, Daw art team. Even at first I was like, what is this new cover? And I brainstormed a ton of other titles by basically being like, the Bible is such a great place to get, especially the King James English version, to get pithy, like weighty sounding things. Obviously, I don't just read it for book titles, but anyways, and so I changed it's Train My Hands to War in a Psalms, and I changed it to Mechanize My Hands to War, which is also grappling with like, there's a lot of violence, especially in the Hebrew Bible, and sort of discussions there. So I'm hoping that kind of answered the title question and some of that composition question, Jamie.
Yeah, and thank you, Jamie, for jumping in with that question. And we have a couple other questions that have come in from Catherine and Lisa, and they're thematically similar, so I'm going to tackle them both simultaneously here. But Catherine saying, you evoke Appalachia so well. What made you decide to set this particular story in Appalachia? And then Lisa asking about your experiences growing up in Appalachia and how that may have impacted the story, and how that led to this interplay between the natural world and the mechanization imagery.
I love that Lisa came up with the natural. She does beautiful artwork related to natural flora and fauna, so that makes sense. So Appalachia is also, I think when you're living there, you don't realize how much it's an identity people have constructed and use as sort of a keyword for a whole bunch of things. And then you kind of, I moved out, for example. I now live in upstate New York, which, to be fair, feels very similar culturally and somewhat landscape wise to Appalachia. And then you kind of realize people are talking about this Appalachian like region and area, and you're like, what is this area? Was I part of that? What is that? And so much of it's grappling with how people utilized resources and to some extent created poverty and or business in certain areas. It's a lot about isolation to a certain extent. Part of the reason people seem to be fascinated with Appalachia is that it's preserved some things because of its at least historical isolation. So how it's coming out of that right now is also an interesting moment. And people sometimes also kind of view it as like, I don't know, this pristine captured idea of what like American like everyday experiences or something like this is part of Americano. So partly I just grew up there, across the river from West Virginia. And so it's just what I know. And again, when I went to grad school and other places and people comment on like my accent or my diction, I'm like, I have an accent. I say things differently. What? So I'm also kind of just exploring myself, what it means to be from that area. So I like looking at that. Because again, I feel like books are always just asking questions about who we are.
Yeah.
But I think it's also good as a contrast with sci-fi and things like that, because it's starting to pick up traction. So Ali Stein's books, for example, are a lot about dystopia in Appalachia. So something people are starting to look at, I think, because the contrast seems so interesting to people. It's a place that has gained a reputation as being more isolated, less access to internet, less access to lots of things. And then we're introducing like what happens when we put far future tech or near future tech into that setting.
Yeah, I think that there is also an element of the that exclusion. I think really heightens the sort of age of the region. You know, the Appalachian Mountains are the oldest mountain range in the world, and there are a lot of ways that you can kind of play with that space. So thinking of, you know, like the Old Gods of Appalachia podcast, which is a phenomenal podcast to anyone out there. But, you know, the idea that it can be a space for like a tapestry for horror as well as sci-fi. You're putting outside other things onto this space that feels in many people's minds so stable and consistent for all of the good and ill that evokes for people. Yeah. You know, you talking about asking questions or posing questions, I'm going to tie that into my next question here. This is a book that doesn't handhold. And I think that you are the sort of writer that doesn't handhold, and you pose a lot of questions without offering answers to those questions. Was this always an approach to your writing, or is this a style that you kind of grew into as you continued to write?
So I think definitely when I was writing as like a teenager, not my probably highest point of my literary career. And when I was fascinated with fairy tales and was doing novel length retellings of fairy tales, which I still love and still would like to work with. So I'm not dismissing the fairy tale novel, but the way that I wrote them as a teenager was like, and here is the moral about how love solved everything, the end. And so I've really come to hate that as the moral of stories. So when I watch a movie and it's like, and love, and I'm like, you lost me. And that's why this book is so loveless. No, I'm just kidding. People love each other in this book. So I was gonna say, I think I hear the puppies.
Yeah, I think you can hear my dog barking in the next room.
So, oh man, I just lost where I was.
Not having a moral to the story.
Yes, thank you. You can also tell the semester just finished. So ultimately, though, I don't think, like, I'm a 38-year-old living in upstate New York. I don't necessarily have any more answers than my readers do. So I don't feel like it's my job to be like, hey, here's the answer, because I don't have one. What I do have are questions that just happen to be in the form of a narrative and a story. And I'm hoping that it means we start, if anything, I'm hoping that it helps people start asking the right questions about how we behave as opposed to giving them the one answer.
It is very Socratic of you. I'd expect nothing less from a professor. Yeah, I think often about the quote from Socrates, from Plato through Socrates. The only thing I know is that I know nothing, and the older I get, the more I think about that on on a regular basis. Um, but yeah, and this is something I think will be present for a lot of readers with this book. That it poses a lot of really interesting and evocative questions, a lot of timely questions, but there are no answers in the book. But I think that that's great because it means that it opens the discourse, like you said. Yeah. Um,
I'm absolutely willing to sign copies of the book, as somewhat embarrassed as I am to try to sell them to people, Michael. But yeah, I will sign the book.
I will say, as that is an embarrassment that you will just have to get over being a published author. This is the whole point of publishing a book. Um, can we talk about Eli, our antagonist? And I'll be careful not to give anything away here, but we get glimpses throughout his life that hint at how he becomes radicalized in his ideology, and it creates for the reader a degree of pathos for him. We understand him. How crucial was that element for you when building up the story's antagonist?
Yeah, for a lot of the novel, he's sort of just, you only hear about him through others. And so it's just about the negative impact he's had on others. And those negative impacts are real. The book doesn't dismiss them just by exploring his backstory as well. But I don't know how we can truly understand people unless we know where they come from. We tend to simplify and flatten, I think, people we don't agree with, perhaps, because that's easier. And then we forget, like, oh, this complexity that I feel as a person and a human being, my interiority, is also true of other people. So I also don't want to fall too simply into the trap of, like, and then we can forgive them for all they did because they got bullied as a kid or something. I don't want to fall into that sort of like narrative trap either. So it's not a matter of judgment and forgiveness so much as it is a matter of understanding that historical systems build on each other and produce our current situation. And it's getting a glimpse into the most recent generation of that. And you can kind of imply a little bit, I think, from his backstory, what may have been the experience of his parents and so on, that builds up to the current moment. So yeah, because he is still an antagonist, but he's also partially, I mean, he's the protagonist of his own story. And his being the protagonist of his stories makes him the antagonist of our main characters, which I suppose is sort of what always happens, perhaps.
Yeah. There's the I feel like I'm conjuring the, you can hear my dogs barking in the background again, I apologize. I feel like I'm conjuring the Dark Knight here, but I can't remember if this is actually the Dark Knight, but I feel like I'm remembering the statement from the Joker to Batman, basically saying, like, you're one bad day away from becoming me. It's just a matter of perspective and context that creates these sorts of identities for ourselves, or creates these perspectives on the difference between good and evil in our minds. It's another one of those questions that I find really evocative in the story. But I wanted to hear your thoughts on that. And I have one more question that I'll ask, but we're getting towards the end of the hour. If we have any more questions from anybody in the audience, anything you want to ask, you've been holding on to, please, now's the time. But while people are typing their thoughts out, I will just go ahead and ask. We know that readers are always going to bring their own critical lenses to bear on a story and draw their own conclusions. This is one of the great joys about putting a story out into the world. It becomes something bigger than us. Even so, what do you hope readers take away from Mechanize My Hands to War?
Yeah, it's been interesting reading reviews, because you'll read a review and you'll be like, wow, that was spot on. But you didn't realize until you yourself read it that, like, it captured so much what you were trying to say without realizing it. So I feel like I'm almost paraphrasing one of the reviews. I think it was from like Reading Reality or something like that.
I read that one
So I
too.
want to make sure I give her credit for that. Credit for interpreting my stories so that I better understand it. But I think what does sort of stick out is that ultimately, as much as androids are in this story, and as much as it's about defining against the other, and as much as they themselves have perspectives in it, it's a reminder of like what are the larger systems that mechanize these machines or sentient beings, however you end up defining them in the book, the larger structures that kind of put them out there and use them because they're like, hey, we can save a few dollars if we put in a robot worker here instead of. So those people, that structure, sometimes it's almost like it's not one person you can point to. Sometimes the structures we've created, how their investment in stripping sentience from things so they can better use them, and that includes from people too, which is why we get the situations we're in. But then also how do those tools, so in this case android healthcare workers, android soldiers, like what are they left to do with, they've been deliberately created to have no sentience, we'll find that they have it. What do they do in this world? So I think it's about, I don't know, try to look at the bigger picture, what structural things are driving this, are driving the changes around you, so that we can kind of target social change where it needs to go, and where it needs to help things.
Yeah. We have a question here from David, who asks, many media depictions of Appalachia, Hunger Games, Winter's Bone, etc., center around a feeling of hopelessness, along with the isolation, often through socioeconomic pressures, opioids, etc. What do you think of these depictions, and does a similar component feature in your work?
Ooh, what a question, David. What a question.
It's a loaded one.
I know. First of all, I'm just now trying to grapple with the idea of thinking of Hunger Games as Appalachia, and so I'm like, oh. So aside from that, no, it's good, David. It's good. I mean, I do hint at some of those things. Like one character has a mom that it seems like is probably dealing with some sort of opioid addiction or something like that. I didn't get into some of that stuff as explicitly because I didn't want to completely appropriate something that wasn't mine. So my upbringing in Appalachia, I lived in this area, part of this culture, but I was also upper middle class. So it would be false of me to say that I had a lot of experience with like some of the things that get depicted. And so I didn't want to, I don't think steal's the word exactly. I think you can research and look into things in really important ways, but I didn't have that level of research. I hadn't brought that to this. So I'm thinking a little bit more about some of the mentalities and the ideologies that seem to stick kind of across class and racial differences and things like that in Appalachia. I think it's also the feeling of hopelessness one becomes difficult as well, because I think it's one of those things where outside perspective and inside perspective might look a little different sometimes too. How do I express this? Like, I think people writing about Appalachia can kind of put that onto Appalachia more than it puts on itself, which is an interesting thing to navigate. So I would say there are characters in this novel that don't feel hopeless, or they feel hopeless but for very different reasons and in very different regions outside of Appalachia. but I don't think they would point to Appalachia itself as the problem, if that makes sense, as part of that isolation.
I think like any culture, it's not monolithic, and I think you do a really interesting job and a really good job of creating a lot of diverse perspectives on how characters sort of interact with the region, their various connections to the land. Like Ernst and Shay obviously are farmers, and a lot of their story revolves around how they're trying to tend the land, while also tending to their own relationship. And there are elements of it that are present for some to a degree, but yeah, I would agree it's not what I would call, I think, drastic or what's what I'm looking for, caricatured. Yeah, it's not caricatured.
And I will say, like, Winter's Bone, I think, is great. In order to write something like Winter's Bone, I would have to do an entirely different type of research than I did for this novel.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up at the end of the hour. We can draw this to a close then. I have the link for the Google form queued up here. Would you like me to share that?
Yeah, so we have, we'd like to offer what authors call swag, at least, if anybody's interested. So obviously, if you're in the area and you want me to sign a book or something like that, I can. If you're not in the area, I am willing to mail out signed book plates so that you can put it in the book, and I have bookmarks and things like that. So if you are interested in any of that, there's a Google form just because I would need an address to mail it to. So if you want that kind of swag, feel free to drop your name and sort of mailing address there so that I can send that out to you as a thank you for attending. And yeah, if I'm be happy to hear from people more in different contexts. Thank you all for like reading and showing up. It's really heartwarming.
Yeah, it is exciting to see what at this point is years of years of work and years of waiting. We finally get to see this in readers' hands, and that's really special.
David, I don't know if this is a hint for the New Mexico reading fair. I am semi hoping I can get out there. David runs a great you could put the specific title. I know I'm just gonna mess it up, David, but does a great thing in the spring, and they usually bring like a much bigger name than me to campus, but then have other panelists as well. I'm hoping to do some stuff at Williamson Lectureship on Science Fiction. Hoping to do some stuff in the area and some local bookshops. And then some bookshops have reached out to me from like Virginia and other places, so potentially some more virtual events through things like that. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. Again, the holiday season makes it a little difficult scheduling stuff in December. So probably stuff will be happening in like January and February.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I'll go ahead and post this one more time. We've had a few more comments there in the chat, and I'll just make sure that it's close to the bottom for everybody. But I just want to say thank you to everyone once again. Everyone, especially who is currently reading the book, we hope you enjoy it. And thank you for spending this evening with us, getting the chance to kind of celebrate this together. And we look forward to, I guess, the next one from Erin.
I gotta
no pressure.
Thanks, everyone.
Semester's done, Erin.
I got a whole month. I need to write it up. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
So now everybody's going to hear the tech side of it as they log off. But should I end stream, presumably?
Yes, okay. You should.